Hello everyone, this is the Casual Fan. We are 15 races into the season and we have Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton separated by just 2 points in a season that will go down as one of the best seasons ever in the history of Formula 1. Lewis Hamilton leads the championship from Max Verstappen by just 2 points, a gap that is one of the closest we have seen in a long time in a Formula 1 season. At this stage, it's always nice to look back and see how the season has panned out. More importantly, it answers one key question that many fans love to argue about this season. Well, who has been the better driver? Is it Hamilton or is it Max? In this video, we do a breakdown of how the two drivers have done in every race, and then after that, the final points should give us a concrete idea of how both the drivers have performed this season. To make things easier, we will rate both Hamilton and Max out of 10 for each race, and the cumulative score should give us a good idea of how both Lewis and Max compare against each other. So without further ado, let's start with the first race of the season. Wow, it's hard to explain, but it almost feels like it was yesterday when the season started. The anticipation, the excitement of a new season, a season where, for a change, we had the possibility of any team other than Mercedes having the ability to fight for the title. And any driver other than Lewis Hamilton having the tools to win races on a consistent basis. At Bahrain, Max was duly able to put his Red Bull on pole, with Lewis slotting himself in second. During the race, it did appear that Red Bull had a decisive advantage of maybe a tenth or two over Mercedes, but things would change as Lewis Hamilton was able to execute an alternative strategy adopted by Mercedes and fend off Max Verstappen to pick up the win in the first race of the season. Now, in my view, that was arguably one of the best drives of Hamilton's career, and in a way, Hamilton's pace in the end with the worn out tires did catch Max and Red Bull by surprise. To be very honest, I don't think there are many drivers in Formula 1 or even on that grid who would have been able to do what Hamilton did at Bahrain that day. If I have to give a rating to the two drivers for Bahrain, then I would give Hamilton a perfect 10 because he achieved the maximum he could have with the package at his disposal and hardly made any mistake throughout the weekend. For Max, however, I'd have to give him a 9 for this weekend because he put the car on pole and pretty much did everything that he was supposed to, just that if you compare it to Lewis, who had a special drive, Max just could not reach the level that Lewis was on that day. Imola wasn't really expected to be a great race by any of the F1 fans this year. The track is not the most conducive for overtakes, and the current generation of cars are just not the kind that you would expect to deliver great wheel-to-wheel racing on such kind of a track. The drops of rain just before the start of the race changed all that as Lewis Hamilton, who started the race on pole, was jumped by Max Verstappen, who would take the lead from Hamilton at the first corner and never look back. Hamilton, on his part, was able to finish second in the race, but was extremely lucky to finish there after damaging his car and slipping off into the gravel early in the race. If it was not for the red flag, Hamilton was destined to finish outside the podium positions. Regardless, the red flag helped Mercedes and Lewis to make the required repairs on the car and would eventually help Lewis climb back up to finish second in that race. For this race, it's hard not to give Max a perfect 10 for the way he drove in what were arguably tricky conditions at Imola and win the race. For Lewis, Imola was a fortunate race, and for this race I'd give him a 7 for going off into the gravel and even losing the race lead to Verstappen at the start of the race. The Portuguese Grand Prix was a track where Mercedes seemed to hold a distinct advantage over Red Bull, and that was exactly how it played out in the race. Max did initially jump Lewis Hamilton during the safety car restart, but Hamilton, equipped with a much faster car, was able to get that position back and in due time pick off his teammate Valtteri Bottas to win the race. For Lewis, it was an almost perfect weekend where even though he lost the pole to Bottas, he was able to get the position back during the race and eventually win. For this race, Hamilton gets a perfect 10 for maximizing the car's strengths and ending up with the win. For Verstappen, it's hard to find faults in his drive as he pretty much achieved the maximum that he could have with the car at his disposal. For this race, he gets a 9 out of 10. Now, talking about the Spanish Grand Prix, by this time it was starting to become clearer that Mercedes were edging away in the championship. Lewis had a clear advantage over Max in terms of pace and was able to put the Mercedes on pole, while Max had to be content with P2. Max did try his best as he was able to jump Lewis at the start, but Red Bull was never able to develop any kind of gap over Lewis on the track. Once Lewis opted to switch to a two-stopper, Max was a sitting duck and would lose the race lead to Hamilton. Hamilton would go on to win the race comfortably while Max would finish second. For both Hamilton and Max, it's hard to find any faults in the drives as both were able to achieve the maximum that was available with the car they had at their disposal. For the Spanish Grand Prix, I'm giving both Hamilton and Max a perfect 10 as both were faultless throughout the weekend. In many ways, it was the Monaco Grand Prix where, at least for me, the wheels started turning towards Red Bull in the championship. Max Verstappen had a peerless race once he was able to secure pole position on Saturday. Lewis Hamilton, on the other hand, had a poor race by all measures. While his teammate would qualify on the front row, Hamilton qualified 7th and would finish the race 7th as well. For Monaco, Max Verstappen gets a perfect 10 in my view, while Hamilton's average weekend results in a rating of 6 out of 10. While the Grand Prix at Azerbaijan was a disaster for Lewis Hamilton, it was heartbreak for Max Verstappen. In the lead with a comfortable advantage over his teammate in second and poised to extend his lead in the championship, Verstappen would suffer a puncture near end of the race and would have to retire. Hamilton on his part was in prime position to take advantage during the race start from the second position, but would suffer a monumental mess up on the restart and not even score a single point. In the end, Baku resulted in a DNF for both Hamilton and Verstappen, though in contrasting circumstances. Max gets a 9 out of 10 from my side as he was well on his way to a comfortable victory, while Hamilton, because of his monumental error on the restart, gets a rating of 5 out of 10. Well, I have to say, I didn't expect the race to be this good, but I guess the 2021 season really is a gift that keeps on giving. It was a fantastic race and Max would make use of the alternative strategy to pick up a well-deserved win at Paul Ricard. Lewis Hamilton would finish second in the race behind Max, and even though he tried his best, it just wasn't enough to keep Max behind. For the French Grand Prix, I find it hard to give anything less than a perfect score for both Max and Lewis because, at least in my view, they drove the wheels off their cars and could not have done anything better than what they were able to. The Styrian Grand Prix was, well, an all-out Max Verstappen domination. Max put the car on pole and never looked back. It was a dominant race win in a race where he had comfortable pace advantage over the rest of the field, including the Mercedes. And no one could pose any kind of meaningful challenge to the Dutch driver. Lewis, however, on the other hand, had an average weekend as even Bottas was able to outqualify him, and even in the race, Lewis did not have the smoothest of races. He would finally finish a distant second place, and if we have to rate the two drivers here, then I'll have to give Max a perfect score for a faultless weekend, while Lewis gets an 8 on a weekend where he was slightly off color and didn't really have the car to challenge for the win either. The Austrian Grand Prix, again conducted at the Red Bull Ring, was a repeat of what happened in the last race for Max Verstappen. Another race where he achieved pole and would remain unchallenged throughout the race and win comfortably. For Lewis, the Austrian Grand Prix was worse than what happened at the Styrian Grand Prix because he would have an average qualifying performance and even in the race would damage his car by running over a curb. Ultimately, Hamilton would finish outside the podium behind even Lando Norris in a McLaren. For the race, Max gets a perfect 10, while Hamilton and his average outing gives him just 6 out of 10 points for this race. Now, talking about the British Grand Prix, the most controversial race we've had this season. We saw Max and Lewis crash for the first time this season, and it would ultimately lead to a massive 51G crash for Verstappen, and Lewis would eventually go on to win the race. First of all, I'm not going to apportion the blame of the crash or even give my views on it. This was something that happened, and stewards gave the penalty that seemed fit to Lewis. Now, rating the two drivers for this race, I would rate their performance until their crash. Because post that, let's be honest, Hamilton was driving the fastest car on the grid by some margin, and it doesn't make sense to judge what he did once Max was out of the race. So, now talking about the weekend, this was the first weekend that employed the sprint qualifying format, and in many ways, the sprint qualifying did make its mark. In Friday qualifying, Hamilton was spectacular as he put together a time that was comfortably good enough for pole. During sprint qualifying, however, Max would turn the tables on Lewis as he jumped Hamilton during the start and would comfortably win the sprint race and score 3 points for the win. Taking 2 sessions into consideration, even though Lewis was absolutely fantastic during the Friday qualifying, when it mattered, when points were being given, Max was able to pick up the pieces and win the sprint race to score valuable points. In the end, if we have to rate the two drivers, I would give Max 6 out of 10 for the British Grand Prix, while Lewis would get 1 less point and score 5 out of 10 for the weekend because he did lose out in the sprint race. Grand Prix in terms of championship was another disaster for Max as Valtteri Bottas and his poor start led to Max suffering huge damage on his car. He would limp home with minimal points for this race as he could salvage only a handful points in a car that was massively compromised and stuck in traffic. Hamilton, on his part, suffered because of a poor strategy call by Mercedes and would fight his way through the field to ultimately classify in P2. For this race, Hamilton would get an 8 out of 10 for his recovery drive, while Max gets a 5 out of 10 because he really had his hands tied behind his back when it came to the race, and it's tough to make a judgment in such a scenario. We had the Belgian Grand Prix getting washed out and the points getting scored pretty much on the basis of what the drivers did in qualifying. For this race, we will rate the drivers in the same way because there's hardly any other parameter for us to evaluate these drivers on. So talking about Max, well, if we are honest about his skills, then the qualifying at Spa was a supreme example of Max Verstappen's class, as he was pretty much chasing the Mercedes of Lewis Hamilton and the McLaren of Lando Norris in the wet weather at Spa. Even on their first run in Q3, it was Lewis Hamilton who had been able to set the fastest time of anyone. Yet, when it was crunch time, Max was able to sail his way to pole, with Hamilton only able to put together a lap that was third fastest and even slower than George Russell in a Williams. For this race, Max gets a perfect 10 because of his lap in the wet at Spa, while Hamilton, who was able to put together the third fastest lap, gets a score of 8 out of 10. Next, we had the Dutch Grand Prix, and the Dutch Grand Prix was, well, in many ways, it was a repeat of what had happened at the Austrian and the Styrian Grand Prix, as Max Verstappen, driving for the first time in his home race, put the Red Bull on pole and then was unchallenged as he went on to win his home race. Lewis Hamilton, on his part, tried his best at every possible juncture to unsettle Max, but was only able to finish second behind the Red Bull. For this race, it's hard to take a point of each of the two drivers, as both were able to extract the maximum that was possible out of the car and didn't make any noticeable mistakes on their way. In my view, both Max and Lewis get a perfect 10 for this race. Now, coming to the Italian Grand Prix, a race that has been shockingly prone to action during the race in the last couple of years. The race was the battleground for the second clash between Lewis and Max. This time around, though, both Lewis and Max would be out of the race and neither would score a point. However, again, for this race, we would be rating the two drivers on what they had done before the crash. Max, on his part, had done a stellar job to finish second in the sprint qualifying and ultimately be in a great position to win the race. Lewis, on his part, had an average outing at Monza. He was out-qualified by Bottas during the Friday qualifying session, and then in the sprint qualifying, he would mess up his start yet again and was unable to score any points in either the race on Sunday or the sprint qualifying on Saturday. All this, despite comfortably having the fastest car on the grid, was slightly disappointing, and in a way, this did set up the chain reaction that would lead to Max and Lewis crashing into the first turn at Monza. If we have to rate the two drivers, I'll give Max a 6 out of 10, while Lewis gets a 4 out of 10 for not capitalizing on what was a comfortably quicker car during the weekend. And now finally coming to the most recent race, the Russian Grand Prix. For the first time this season, arguably, we saw how intense the rivalry between Lewis Hamilton and Max Verstappen really is. Lewis was elated to win what was his 100th race in his career, but even then, the happiness was dampened slightly when he looked across and in P2 saw a familiar Red Bull with Max Verstappen climbing out of it. Hamilton had been able to win the race after a whole load of struggle and by making the right calls in the rain. However, he would not have expected Max to climb up to P2 after starting 20th in the race. In a way, this was the case of the cream rising to the top in Formula 1, as both Lewis and Max were destined for a less flattering result until rain hit the track and turned things entirely on its head. Lewis would win the race after starting 4th on track, while Max would finish 2nd after starting 20th. However, the weekend was less than optimal for both the drivers, as Max was destined to finish a suboptimal 7th if it had not rained, while Lewis was on his way to finish 2nd in the race. Lewis also had a rather lucky outing in qualifying when the decision to not pit for slicks and then subsequently Lewis damaging the front wing while entering the pits didn't cost him as much as it potentially should have. All in all, these were solid weekends for both the drivers, but far from the kind of perfection we have started expecting from them. If we have to rate the performance of both the drivers, I feel that both get a score of 8 on 10, as even though the results flatter to deceive what really happened, this was not their best showing by far. Okay, so after going through the race and adding the points given for each and every Grand Prix, we have Max Verstappen at 132 points, while Lewis Hamilton is at 115 points, which it does in a way prove that Max Verstappen has been a better driver this season as compared to Lewis Hamilton. Sure, in the standings, Hamilton leads Max by 2 points, but it would be hard to disagree that Hamilton has had the lion's share of the luck this season. The gravel visit at Imola didn't cost Hamilton anything, while on the other side, Max lost a race win with an unfortunate puncture at Baku. The crash at the British Grand Prix, for which Hamilton was the guilty party, at least in the view of stewards, gave Hamilton a huge 26-point advantage, and then of course, Max would get his car smashed to pieces by Valtteri Bottas at Hungary. If not for the unfortunate circumstances, Max would be leading the championship right now with a huge margin. But as it turns out, that's not the case. Nevertheless, if we do accumulate the race by race performance of both the drivers, it's hard to doubt who has been the better driver overall this season. And at least until the Russian Grand Prix, Max Verstappen has proven to be the better driver. So these were my views. What do you guys think? Is it Max or is it Lewis who has been the better driver this season? Do let me know in the comment section. Thanks for watching.